Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for coming. One quick note before we start. There are sign-in sheets being passed around that ask everyone to sign in. It helps us with our budget for future events to show that we've got a lot of people here. So please sign in. Okay, we'll get started. Without wasting time, I'm going to introduce our panelists, distinguished professors from environmental law from law schools around the city. We've got Michael Gerrard, who teaches courses on environmental and climate change law and energy regulation at Columbia Law School. He's a director of Columbia Sabin Center for Climate Change Law and chairs the faculty of Columbia University's Earth Institute. From 1979 through 2008, he practiced environmental law in New York, most recently as partner in charge of the New York office of Arnold & Porter. He is a prolific writer on environmental law and climate change, twice receiving the Association of American Publishers' Best Law Book Award for works on environmental law and brownfields. He has written or edited 11 books, including Global Climate Change and U.S. Law, the leading work in its field, and the 12-volume Environmental Law Practice Guide. We have Michael Herz, who teaches courses on environmental, administrative, and climate change law at Cardozo Law School. He served as Cardozo's Vice Dean from 2006 to 2009 and Senior Associate Dean from 1996 to 2000. Before that, he was a staff attorney at the Environmental Defense Fund for 3 years. He has written or edited 5 books, most of them focused on administrative law. And we have Professor Dale Jamieson, a professor of environmental studies and philosophy, affiliated professor of law, affiliated professor of bioethics, and chair of the Environmental Studies Department at New York University. He has written or co-written 5 books on environmental issues and edited or co-edited another 9. He's on the editorial boards of several journals, including Environmental Humanities, Environmental Ethics, and the Journal of Agricultural and Environmental Ethics.
So, before we start the discussion, I just want to go over 2 things that, surprisingly to me, but maybe not to a lot of people here, not everybody is 100% familiar with. The Clean Power Plan. We did an event on this last year. I don't think all of you guys were there. Not as many people as this time. But basically, the Clean Power Plan is a comprehensive Environmental Protection Agency (EPA) rule to limit emissions from coal power plants across the United States and encourage renewable energy use. Numerous states, it came out in late 2014, numerous states challenged its legality when it was announced, and the case is currently being decided by the D.C. Circuit Court. After the D.C. Circuit publishes its decision, the case is likely to proceed to the Supreme Court, where right now things are not looking particularly good. The Paris Climate Agreement, or Paris Treaty, is an agreement signed by 192 nation states and the European Union. Signatories pledge to lower emissions to the point that together they will prevent the Earth's temperature from rising over 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. There is a general scientific consensus that 2 degrees is the maximum amount of warming the Earth can tolerate without getting humanity into truly dangerous and unpredictable territory. Well, 1.5 may allow several low-lying island nations to survive. The treaty is not legally binding, because a legally binding treaty would need to be approved by the U.S. Senate. The Obama administration that worked on this knew that would never happen, that it would never be approved with the Republican Senate, so the agreement was crafted to be non-binding, so we wouldn't need Senate approval. The idea was that, under this arrangement, the world would still have at least some kind of agreement on tackling climate change with the United States as a party. The man slated to take office as the next president of the United States says he will ensure the U.S. abandons the Clean Power Plan and walks away from the Paris Treaty as soon as possible. And that's why you're all here. So, let's talk about where do we go from here. We're going to ask a number of questions to our panelists. Each question will be directed to a panelist, but once they answer, it will we'll open the floor, and other professors hopefully will be able to respond and debate or add to everyone's responses. So, the first question is, the American system of government is, thankfully, built to provide plenty of checks and balances on those in power. Let's talk about how those checks and balances may work to environmentalists' advantage in the future. The president is constrained by bicameralism, meaning legislation must go through Congress and the Senate before being signed by the president, barring Congress overriding a presidential veto by 2/3 vote. With the Republicans now in control of both houses, what power do the Democrats have to stop them from passing anti-environmental legislation? Is there a chance a new Congress will create anything helpful? How might the filibuster help us or not? And how likely do you think it is that Congress will get rid of the filibuster? We're going to start off with Professor Herz because he is at his, has the home team advantage. Professor Herz, you have the floor.
All right. So I take the question to be really focused on Congress, and it's a good place to start because it's a reminder that one of the deep pathologies, among many deep pathologies in American presidential campaigns, is that they are run as if Congress does not exist, right? As if the president will be a one-person government whose policies he or she, as it turns out he, can act at will. And of course that's not true. One often does need Congress. And this, if the theme of the night is, how worried should we be, this is a reason to be a tiny bit less worried. But of course, as Mark points out, now the Republicans control both houses of Congress and the White House, and that gives them the ability to make real change. I think it's easy to get a little too worried about legislation. Congress is not going to get rid of the EPA. Congress is not going to repeal any of the major environmental laws. There is too fundamental a national consensus at some high level of abstraction about the importance of these laws and the importance of that agency that they're not going to disappear. And what people are really focused on with regard to legislative revisiting legislation is actually not the environmental stuff. It's Obamacare and Dodd-Frank. And if they really do repeal or significantly tinker with those, that's going to require so much work on the legislative side that there won't be time or effort or political chits left over for fundamental changes to the environmental laws. So I don't think we're going to see that. What we will see is three possibilities. One, the possibility of some minor adjustments, right? So is it conceivable that Congress would amend the Clean Air Act to eliminate EPA's authority to regulate greenhouse gases? I think that's conceivable. I don't think it's going to happen, but I think it's conceivable. I don't think it's going to happen, A, because we do still have the filibuster. And my prediction is, if I had to predict, I think it depends a lot on how the Democrats use the filibuster, but if I had to predict, I think that the Republicans will get rid of the filibuster for Supreme Court nominations, tracking what the Democrats did to the Republicans for all other nominations, but not get rid of it for ordinary legislation. But it's very hard to say, because as I say, it depends on how it is used. And I don't know that there are 50 Republican votes, actually, to eliminate authority to regulate greenhouse gases. One of the interesting things about this last election is that two of the Republicans who lost seats, Kelly Ayotte and Mark Kirk, were actually, as Republicans go, pretty good on climate change. They would have been two Republicans who would have voted against that legislation, and now they've been replaced by Democrats. But so there's that possibility. I think it's not going to happen. The two things that are worth keeping your eye out for are this: A, the Congressional Review Act. Do people know about the Congressional Review Act? So the Congressional Review Act was this law that was enacted in the mid-90s, which gives Congress the opportunity to disapprove major regulations adopted by federal agencies. And the basic idea is there are 60 days after the regulation is finalized, during which Congress, if it wants, can pass a joint resolution of disapproval. Now, a joint resolution of disapproval means both houses of Congress plus the president. It's generally pretty hard to do. Indeed, it's generally impossible, because it's very rare that the president will sign, rather than veto, a resolution disapproving something one of his own agencies has done. But the one circumstance in which it can happen is when there has been an intervening election. Indeed, the one time in history that it did happen was where there was an intervening election. There was an OSHA rule about ergonomics adopted toward the end of the Clinton administration that was disapproved once George Bush was in the White House. You have a 60-day period, but it's 60 legislative days, not 60 calendar days. So actually this brings us back to about May of 2016. Exactly when in May is unclear. It depends on how many days the Congress meets between here and the end of the session. But significant rules issued between, call it June 1st and the beginning of the new Congress are subject to this joint resolution of disapproval procedure. And it seems almost certainly that some will be subjected to it. Not waters of the United States, which predates, June 1st of this year. Not the Clean Power Plan. They're too old for this, but some for sure. And the other thing, and then I'll shut up, is just to keep your eye on is stuff that's not specifically about environmental regulation, but is about agency power generally. So over the last 6 years, Congress has taken very seriously, and the House in particular has passed a number of initiatives that would just make it much harder for agencies to regulate. And also initiatives that would make courts less deferential to agencies in reviewing agency regulations. So these have been highly ideologically polarizing initiatives. The Republicans have supported them. The Democrats have been opposed to them. The big question is, now that the shoe is on the other foot, do the Republicans go ahead or not? The Trump administration or current Republicans may actually want courts to be quite deferential to agencies once there's a Republican administration. It's not clear that all of this stuff is going to go ahead. But some, for example, there's something called the Scrub Act. All these things have horrifying PR-driven acronyms. The Scrub Act is searching for and cutting regulations that impose unnecessary burdens. Scrub, okay? So we will scrub the Code of Federal Regulations of these unnecessarily burdensome regulations. That's a non-starter with President Obama in the White House. That may well get enacted. And so there's stuff that has nothing, it's not specific to EPA, that could indeed actually get enacted that will make it much harder for agencies to actually get regulations out the door or keep them intact once they do.
Yeah, so the first thing I guess I would say, which I would want to sort of be a prolegomena to everything I say tonight, is to quote Yogi Berra, who said that predictions are dangerous, especially about the future. And I think it's very hard to anticipate a lot of this stuff. But I agree with everything that the previous speaker said. I might just sort of state a couple points a little more provocatively, and then to add something. The kind of provocative restatement is just to say that the legislating just does not seem to be in the DNA of the Republican Congress. That's not what they're about. And I would be very surprised if in fact we don't start getting all kinds of fights in the Congress itself about matters that they think are more important. And really fundamentally the most important thing I think for the Republican Congress is to pass various kinds of bills that were referred to that will make the rich richer, and everything else is kind of secondary as far as that goes. And in terms of doing things about the environment, so much harm can be done simply by the executive branch that you don't really need a lot of congressional action in that area to mess things up. I would want to pay a lot of attention to various kinds of riders that will be attached to must-pass spending bills that the Congress will produce. And I also worry a little that we've become so concerned about climate change, and I say this as someone who's spent the last 30 years working on climate change, published a book on climate change, that there's a lot of other environmental issues, public lands issues, endangered species issues, and so on, in which all kinds of damage can be done, and we may barely notice, or even without thinking hard, that it's an acceptable compromise because we've dodged the worst climate change bullets.
Yeah, as was just said, Trump doesn't really need Congress to shut down EPA regulation of greenhouse gases for now. We'll probably get into that a little bit more. He couldn't permanently shut it down, but he could certainly effectively shut it down for his administration. Just so that, to make sure all of you understand the filibuster rule, that ordinarily It now takes 60 votes in the Senate to get a bill onto the floor, but that is not a function of statute, it's a function of a rule adopted by the Senate, and it would just take 50 or 51 votes, depending on if you have the vice president's vote, to undo that rule. That's called the nuclear option. So the Democrats did that for nominations, for confirmations for all seats except for the Supreme Court. And the question is whether the new Senate might do that for legislation. If they did that for legislation, then they could start repealing the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Clean Air Act, all kinds of things. I agree. I don't think that's likely. I don't think that there are 50 or 51 votes for that extreme option. Even if there were, I don't think there are 50 or 51 votes to repeal the Clean Air Act, for example. A major area where I think congressional action is very likely is on the appropriations front. They can starve the agencies that they don't like. They don't like the IRS. They don't like deficits, but they don't like the IRS. I don't understand how that works. But they don't like EPA, and so EPA could certainly be starved, and as was said, they could also be subject to appropriations riders that would prohibit them from acting in certain areas.
Thank you. Next, starting with Professor Gerrard. The Supreme Court probably won't be looking too friendly to environmentalists in the near future, though we pray Justice Ginsburg lives and works forever. What about the lower courts? What can the lower courts do over the next couple of years? What are the chances that they will do anything? To what extent? What do you think will happen to climate action cases like those being brought by Our Children's Trust and other groups in the United States?
Well, the lower courts are still around to enforce the statutes that are on the books. And so the National Environmental Policy Act and the Endangered Species Act and the Clean Air Act and so forth are still on the books. There are citizen suit provisions that allow citizens to bring suits under them, and I expect that the lower courts will continue to enforce those laws. I don't think that will end. The Our Children's Trust case is a very interesting case that was brought in federal district court in Oregon by a group of children, and to the amazement of many of us, the day after the election, the district judge in Oregon denied a motion to dismiss this case and suggested that there is a substantive due process right to a safe climate. Which is an unprecedented ruling. I find it hard to imagine that that'll survive the Supreme Court. You know, by the time it will get to the Supreme Court, we will presumably have at least one Trump appointee, and I don't see getting enough votes on that court to uphold that. I think it's it's an interesting case to go forward, an interesting organizing tactic, but I'm not looking to it as the silver legal bullet.
Yes, I agree completely. I think the Our Children's Trust case, like a lot of cases, is primarily political rather than legal in its importance. And especially during this period, it's going to be important and necessary to throw all kinds of mud against all kinds of walls to keep these issues alive and in public consciousness and framed in the best possible way. And in that respect, I think this is an important case, and it's important that it's going forward, but we shouldn't expect too much of the final result.
So I agree with that too, though Mark does not. Mark's note kind of takes the opposite position, and he and I have gone back and forth a little on this. The only thing I'd add to what's been said is, remember, a critical thing that the courts do, so the Our Children's Trust is about the courts affirmatively ruling that government must act in some way to protect the environment. The other thing, of course, courts do is review agency rulemakings. And something like the Clean Power Plan or the Waters of the United States rule, those are in place. They've been stayed, but they're in place. They've gone through notice and comment. They are final rules. They're out there. To get rid of them, the Trump administration will have to go through notice and comment. Again, go through a whole nother rulemaking process, and the result of that will be subject to judicial review. It will probably be upheld, I think very likely that the repeal of the Clean Power Plan would be upheld, but Not if they do it sloppily, not if they do it quickly, not if they fail to explain themselves, not if they get the wrong panel. Remember, the DC Circuit still has a majority of Democratic appointees. This is not about sort of ultimate outcomes, but it is about the very laborious and careful steps and time-consuming steps that at least have to be followed.
All right, so in Canada, my once and future home, for years, it's not a joke, for years under Prime Minister Harper, our old Conservative Prime Minister, the biggest provinces in Canada, like Ontario, Quebec, well actually not Ontario yet, but they're going to, but Quebec and British Columbia, and Alberta soon, actually made a lot of headway on dealing with climate change completely without any help from the federal government. This only changed recently upon the election of Prime Minister Trudeau, at which time the federal government said, hey, we can help out with climate change stuff. In what ways can states take up the mantle on climate action here? And to what extent could that make up for federal inaction? Is there a possibility that states like California and New York might make enough progress to keep hope alive for us until environmental sense and sensibility regains power in federal government again? This one is directed first to Professor Jamieson.
So, it depends on what the meaning of hope is. And I have to say that there is something that feels very familiar about this question, because during the Bush years, for example, this was exactly what many of us tried to console ourselves with. Well, we saw California take important steps, well, we saw RGGI being created, and so on and so forth. And it doesn't exactly feel hopeful at this point to think that we might hunker down into hope about what states might do at this point. But surely that will continue. And what it does bring out, I think, is an important, is a kind of larger important point about climate change, which is that the United States federal government is obviously a very important player in terms of what happens to global climate. But it's only one important player. And there are many, many, many important players here, including states and other kinds of jurisdictions, and other nations, and markets, for example. But this is also one of those places where we should remind ourselves that a lot of us might have awakened the day after the election and discovered that there were some people who we thought we knew who we didn't really know. But fundamentally, this isn't a different country in terms of its citizens and its citizens' preferences than it was the day before the election. There is considerable enthusiasm for green energy and for green power and for renewables and for solar and for battery-driven cars and so on. And these kinds of changes to a decarbonized economy, I believe, and I'm hardly ever accused of being an optimist, are going to happen at some point, whether it's 2050 or 2060 or 2070. There's a lot of questions about how much damage we're going to do to other people and to the planet in getting there. But there is a trajectory here that I think is quite likely to prevail. So if you're pinning your hope on will we get to a decarbonized global economy, I say right on. I think we'll get there. But it's not as though there is a single agent on which we should pin this hope. It's not that state action is going to make up for all the damage that's likely to be done by the next administration.
I would add that there are certainly some states that will carry the flag and do a lot of great work. New York, California, Massachusetts, Oregon, a few others, and they will continue. But I think there are a lot of other states that will do good things, but not in the name of climate change. For example, the state that has been far and away the leader in the United States in wind power has been Texas, not because they believe in climate change, but because the economics of wind power in Texas are so favorable. So I think that we may see a lot more of that. The prices of renewables have been declining rapidly. Now, partly because of technological development, partly that's because of really cheap solar cells coming in from China, which may stop if Trump starts a trade war with China, as he has threatened. But I do think that we're going to see a lot of action at the states on clean energy, which is ultimately much more important than having a nominal carbon reduction goal. What we really need to do is decarbonize the economy, and that's a lot of measures, many of which are very economical, and I think will proceed even in climate-denying states.
Yeah, so I agree with that. It's a tiny bit Pollyannish, I think, just in that, you know, the direct climate benefits of state action are marginal. Their indirect benefits may be significant. That is, as a kind of sign of good faith, as a demonstration project, as a prod to the development of new technologies, that's all true. But as Dale just said, there's, you know, there are an awful lot of emitters out there, and controlling things in half the American states doesn't solve the problem, especially if the federal government's rejection of such measures gives, say, China and India an excuse for not controlling emissions. And so it can only be a partial compensation. It can never replace some meaningful federal program.
So in that vein, could Trump bring coal back? Is that even possible in the face of ever cheaper renewable and natural gases? And what would bringing coal back even look like now? How much would there be worker benefit, or would we just see more mountaintop removal and other automatic mining procedures in which the company executives would make the majority of the gains? And what about the workers? You know, what do you think will actually happen to these people in places like West Virginia and Kentucky?
Professor Gerrard.
Well, the short answer to your question is no. There's no way that coal comes back, because the impediment, what has been killing coal mostly, is cheap natural gas. And Trump's plans, if they work, will make natural gas even cheaper. Nobody is building new coal-fired power plants anymore. There are lots of other constraints that are shutting down coal plants. One rule that is in effect and has already gone through and survived a lot of judicial review is called the Mercury and Air Toxics Rule, compliance with which is so expensive a lot of coal plants are shutting down anyway. Moreover, one of the principal hopes for the coal industry had been the export of coal to Asia, particularly China. And again, this trade war that Trump has promised would shut down that export flow as well. I think the question is right, that to the extent that there is some increase in coal production, it will not do much for the workers, because it'll almost certainly be in in surface mining that is highly automated, not very labor intensive, and so it's not going to bring a lot of jobs back. So I don't see any of this being of substantial help to the workforce. I would also point out that there are now a lot more jobs in solar in the United States than there are in coal. And so if there were really an effort to try to increase employment in the energy industry in the United States, it would overwhelmingly focus on renewables and efficiency rather than on fossil fuels, which tend to be capital intensive rather than labor intensive.
The only thing I'd add to that, which seems to be utterly correct in every respect, is, you know, when people talk about the war on coal, here's just a factoid to bear in mind, okay? The peak year for coal mining, that is, say, how many people were coal miners in the United States, was 1923, when there were something like 900,000 coal miners in the United States. Right? A lot of people had that job. And remember, there were many fewer people back then. Right? It was a huge source of employment for many people. The peak year for coal production in the United States was 2008. Okay? And it's gone down a little since then, but still way above, meaningfully above levels of 100 years ago. Okay? So the war on coal has been kind of a failure, right? In that we dig up more and burn more coal than ever, more or less. Okay? What has disappeared are coal mining jobs, okay, which are now somewhere around 70 or 80,000. right? 10% of what they once were, even while coal production has gone up. So there's absolutely been a war on coal miners. Absolutely. It's been waged by, for completely understandable reasons, the coal mining companies. And reflects technological change and market forces. But we're mining an awful lot of coal. As Mike says, it's just going to go down from here. But it is not as if suddenly, for decades we've been shutting down the coal industry. It's just not true.
So, boringly enough, I agree with everything that's been said again, but I would add one thing. I think this is very quickly becomes fundamentally a political question. And Trump doesn't care about coal. Trump cares about angry white males. And so, in that sense...
What do you mean by that?
Just kidding, just kidding. So in that sense, in sense, another thing Trump doesn't care about really is the Republican Party. I think his political strategy, again, modulo Yogi Berra, what do we know about the future? But I think his political strategy will be to triangulate between the Republicans and the Democrats and his base. And that means that in some way he's going to have to, I think, be responsive to the people who elected him. And those are people who, at least to some extent, to some degree, are people who in that election we just had identified with coal as part of what made America great again. Now, exactly what that response will be, given that for all the reasons we've heard, he can't bring back coal mining, I don't know. But I think there will be some response to those people, to those voters, but it won't be to bring back coal.
Anyone have any ideas what the response would look like? No. I don't blame you.
Nothing I'd like to say in public.
Sure. Okay, so our Republican candidate who just won said he will walk away from the Paris Treaty as soon as he gets into office. Since the treaty is non-binding, there's nothing to legally stop him. Some, however, say that the U.S. walking away from the treaty would incur international condemnation and the possibility of diplomatic punishments in some form for other countries party to the accord. Is it possible that the reality of walking away from the treaty would in fact be more difficult and consequential than the next administration has made it out to be? Could these diplomatic realities actually dissuade the Republicans from walking away from the Paris Treaty? Professor Jamieson, you have the floor.
Right, so we can talk about the technicalities of withdrawing from Paris. I mean, it's been ratified through executive authority, and according to the text of the treaty, it would take essentially 4 years after notice to get out of the treaty. But I think the bigger question here, is really a political question. I mean, there are, I think, two broad strategies that are going to be at work in the Trump administration. One is to sort of mess things up in terms of environmental regulation as much as possible. And as been pointed out, a lot of that can be done sort of in relatively quiet and not very public ways by defunding agencies, for example, and all sorts of things that get done through quiet administrative and executive procedures. The other strategy is the grand gesture, the grand symbolic gesture. And I think given the personality of the president-elect, there will be some grand gestures. I'm not sure where they will be and who they will land on. But if the president-elect wanted to make a grand gesture with respect to climate, what he would do is withdraw from the Framework Convention on Climate Change. That he could do with 1 year's notification and essentially remove the United States from the entire international climate regime. I don't know whether he'll do that, but I wouldn't want to bet completely against it. I think it's not beyond the realm of possibility. But if he doesn't do that, then I think he's just likely to make the United States non-compliant with Paris. Because withdrawing from Paris gives you sort of all the bad publicity of the symbolic gesture without actually being the grand symbolic gesture which he seems to like so much.
I mean, Trump seems to relish in international disapproval, except by Putin. So I'm not sure that these standard things that restrain presidents make sense as things to hold him back. You know, the more cabinet members he appoints who have the nickname Mad Dog is not an encouraging sign. It'll be very important to see who he names as head of EPA. Myron Ebel, who's head of the the environmental transition team, is sort of the Darth Vader of environmental regulation, in that he has been a fervent denier for decades, as opposed to Trump, who's kind of a Johnny come lately to that. So that'll tell us a lot. But I think the easiest thing would be for Trump just to announce that he is going to abandon the Paris Agreement. It was agreed to by executive action. It can be withdrawn from executive action, and the heck with what the agreement says about the 4-year waiting period. It'll just say, I'm out, and there's really nothing anybody can do about it.
You know, in a sensible world, one would say, okay, what, you know, your question went to, you know, what are the downsides, the burdens, the consequences of pulling out, and might those be problematic? And as you both suggested, well, maybe, you know, it would be worn as a badge of honor rather than perceived as a burden. In a sensible world, then we would ask, and what are the burdens of staying in, right? How problematic, how hard would it be to do? And then you would weigh those things. That's what sensible people do. The reality is, and this goes to a lot of the discussion of climate change, it's probably not that hard to stay in fact, okay? I mean, the amount of progress we're making is completely inadequate to the problem, but the Paris commitments are inadequate to the problem. I mean, it is striking how sort of ahead of schedule many states are on the Clean Power Plan obligations, how ahead of schedule we are on our own Paris commitment, and so on. It actually is probably pretty feasible for us to meet the Paris goals, that it would not be that consequential. And I just think it's not going to matter to him at all, that fact. And you know, apparently Bill O'Reilly the other day said we should stay in because it's not that big and it'll generate some goodwill, right? And I never thought, like, you know, Bill O'Reilly would sound like the really sensible person who has his eyes on what matters. You know, I think Donald Trump is going to pull out because, exactly as Dale said, you know, he wants to, you know, I can't believe he'll pull out of the Framework Convention, but you know, I don't know, you know, he has a point to make or a pose to strike.
Can I add something to that? I mean, so we may have the first disagreement, which is almost theological by 12th century standards here, but I think there's actually going to be a lot of pushback very quickly to Trump on climate change, in part because I think, you know, remember, he's a minority president by a fairly substantial amount. And I think there are a lot of people who voted for Trump for all sorts of reasons, but you know, climate change denial was not among them. And they're going to be actually quite surprised if that figures very centrally on his immediate agenda. And that's why, if I had to bet, I mean, there's sort of 3 options here. My first bet would just sort of be general non-compliance with Paris, as opposed to some big statement about withdrawing. My second guess would be pulling out of the Framework Convention, and that's because Trump's general strategy, when there's something that looks like, you know, he's really dead in the water on, if he's going to take it on, is he just comes at it full on, head first, all the way, and that would be the Framework Convention. And so my guess, but what do I know, is that getting out of Paris would look like the unacceptable middle ground between those 2 things. It would make it a big issue without just taking it to the people who are his opponents.
I do think it's a good point that he doesn't actually have a mandate on environmental issues. They were completely overlooked in the campaign, and he didn't win the popular vote. And so it's hard for him to really sort of make that case.
Yeah, I mean, before the election, what was his disapproval? Like 60% or something like that? And a significant portion of the votes for him were really anti-Hillary votes. When it's just, do you like Trump? I think that number is going to keep on going up as he actually does things, and as he has shown, he keeps on tweeting and doing other crazy things. He's going to continue to offend additional populations. So I think he's going to become increasingly isolated. But again, who knows?
So that kind of leads into the next conversation that we want to have. So you've all dedicated a significant portion, if not all, of your long and distinguished careers to environmental law and issues. Leading up to this election, what did you tell your students about parties, candidates, how they should vote? If you said anything, what are your feelings now after the outcome of the election? How do you feel about teaching students environmental law under the shadow of a White House that denies that climate change even exists? What would you say to students who plan to pursue careers in environmental law and are now wondering if they should even bother, if they can make a difference?
Start with Professor Herz.
Well, so let me say three things. The first is, I've never said anything about who my students should vote for in the class. And I wouldn't. And I didn't this year. I did for the first time this year, I think in my very long career, say some bad things about a candidate, right? And you can guess which one. And one of the things, for us old guys, the question is, have we been here before or not, right? It feels in many ways like when Ronald Reagan was elected. And in the early years of the Reagan administration, Ann Burford was the head of the EPA, and everyone said, oh, EPA now stands for every polluter's ally. And James Watt was the head of the Department of the Interior, and he was only associated with, developing oil and gas and coal reserves and so on. And it felt really problematic, and there was kind of a disaster at EPA, and then Ruckelshaus came in to save the day, and so on. And I would say this is true not just of environmental issues. Have we been here before or not? And some days I wake up and I say, oh yeah, we've been here before. And other days I wake up and I think Donald Trump is just something different, right? He's not like other situations. And I'm just not at rest about that. Here's what I'd say about going into environmental law. Let me specifically sort of say, does it make sense to go work for the EPA in a Trump administration? Let's say you're here because you are an environmentalist and you want to work to protect the environment. Should you take a job in the Trump administration EPA? And my bottom line is yes. Okay, you should, for a couple of reasons. One is that the huge majority of what any agency does on a day-to-day basis, just sort of implementing their statutes, is unaffected by who the president is or even who the head of the agency is. Right? There's a routine, there are some legal requirements they are implemented. The second thing is that even if the agency is rolling back those requirements or going soft on enforcement, the measures it takes can be done legally or illegally. They can be done in a more or less environmentally protective way. And which of those occurs depends on who it is in the agency that's giving advice, that's reminding people about what legal constraints are, that's laying out the options for the policymakers. Third, the career people at a place like EPA really do kind of run the show. It's a famous and standard point that folks come in to run the agency and the organizational chart says they're in charge and real life says that the organizational chart is upside down. And there is something to that. Today, Gina McCarthy gave a talk at the National Press Club, which was live streamed, so I watched it, and the very last question was, what advice would you have for your successor? And she said, I thought very appropriately and pointedly and a little poignantly, listen to the career staff. Listen to what they have to tell you. And that was both a kind of plea, but also a kind of warning, right? That actually to succeed in an agency, you do need to. And that means the career staff has some influence. And then the last, I guess the last point I would just make is I think the role of career staff is, okay, you've got the policy folks and the political appointees you've got. They're going to have certain priorities. Your job is to explain their options in a way that they can understand and to try and speak their language. And so if the concern is some perceived conflict between environment and jobs, and you actually really in your heart believe that conflict is false, which it often, though not always unfortunately, but often is, then your job is to lay out the options in a way that, see, you can do this thing which is environmentally protective and also economically beneficial. So I think actually there's and I guess then the last thing would just be he's not going to be president forever. Right?
Well, that's the most optimistic thing.
Yeah, we haven't talked about the constitutional amendment that's going to let that happen. So for all those reasons, I think, yeah, you can be depressed and discouraged and it's not ideal, but in fact, I would urge people actually not to throw up their hands and disappear and not go into government, but just the opposite.
There's more work for environmental lawyers to do than ever. There will have to be enforcement of the existing environmental laws, and to the extent that EPA doesn't do it, it's up to the environmental lawyers on the outside to use the books, the laws that are still on the books, and I think will remain on the books to do that. There will have to be a great deal of action at the state level, and some states will be very exciting places to work. We need to completely transform the energy economy. We need to be building an enormous number of wind farms and solar farms and transmission lines for the power and many, many other things. All of that is going to be a massive amount of transactional work and other kinds of work for lawyers. And as the climate worsens, there's going to be an immense amount of work required to adapt to the climate change that is coming. It's going to have to change our land use patterns, our construction practices, and many other things. So there's an enormous amount of work for lawyers growing out of this. I too practiced throughout the Reagan administration, and some of it was pretty depressing, but there was no lack of constructive things to do. As to whether you should work for EPA, it would unquestionably be good for society if you were to work for EPA. The question is it good for you to work for EPA? And I think that on that, I'm going to hold judgment until we see who's in charge of it and just how it plays out there. You could find that in a year or two, whenever you graduate, walking around the halls of EPA is a really dispiriting place to be. Or you may find that there are places where people are very happy to do their work. I would hold off on making that kind of decision to the extent that you have options.
So for me, I just totally resonate with the idea that this feels like Reagan in 1980, especially for those of us who work in the environment, because for both of these guys, they didn't get elected because of their hostility to the environment. It was part of their package, but it wasn't really what they cared most about. And in both cases, neither of them had their best 10,000 friends to staff as political appointees in agencies that they didn't care very much about, like environmental agencies. And so what you got were not just cronies, but you got cronies of cronies of cronies, which is basically how you get to Myron Ebel. I mean, he's about 3 circles removed from the initial Trump team. And I think what's likely to happen is in the next 2 years in these agencies is what's likely to happen during the Reagan years, which is that they will run wild for 2 years. And there will be all kinds of craziness that's actually really hard to imagine, because these agencies will be staffed by people who have no idea what they're doing in many cases, and no real network. But the optimistic thought is, when we go back to Reagan 80 to 82, a lot of those people wound up getting indicted. And the ones who didn't get indicted got hounded from office. And once that happened, and Reagan started thinking about this thing that politicians think about, re-election, the administration became not one that any of us, I think, liked very much, but it became one that was on the map. And it was an administration in which some good things were done, like, for example, the Montreal Protocol on ozone. So I wouldn't be surprised if there, I mean, again, who knows, but I wouldn't be surprised if there isn't something like that trajectory. Now, just 2 other things. One is, it always breaks my heart that there just aren't more environmental law jobs for people who want to be on the right side of environmental law. I think this is just a societal tragedy, and you know, there's just nothing to say that's good about that, although it's been pointed out that there are other areas of law to work in where one can do good environmental work, and all that's true, but I think just something very sad about how this profession works just has to be acknowledged in that way. And this isn't very encouraging in another way, but to say that legal training is actually very good for all kinds of things and not just the practice of law. And there's all sorts of ways of doing environmental work that isn't just strictly environmental legal work. And I think it's really worth thinking about that and taking that seriously. And I just have to end this with an anecdote, since it kind of started with about depression. And I can remember during kind of the very worst days of the George W. Bush presidency, I was at a conference and I ran into a congressman named George Miller, who was a very old Democratic congressman, an excellent Democratic congressman from the East Bay of California, from Oakland, represented Oakland. A good old Irish liberal from the San Francisco Bay Area. And I was having breakfast with him and I said, George, you must be really depressed. I mean, you know, you've lost the House, you're outnumbered, these guys are in control, they're running wild. And he's kind of this big guy, and he kind of just said, every morning I wake up and the first thing I do is read the newspaper and I say, how am I going to get these bastards today? And I think we're going to need a lot more of the spirit of George Miller.
That leads amazingly into our next question, which is, so as the title of this event kind of says, basically, what do we do? What can and should people, students, lawyers, generally concerned citizens do in the future, now and in the future, to protect the environment? What should they do day to day? What should they be planning? What do you tell, you know, the person you sit next to on the subway or run into in the hallway? Just basically people, not necessarily environmental lawyers. What do each of these people here tonight do? And we can start, since we started with Professor Herz, we can end with Professor Herz and go left to right.
Look, I mean, in your day-to-day life, right, how you choose to live your life, nothing has changed. You should live your life the way you deem environmentally responsible. In terms of trying to change the rest of the world outside your own life, I don't have something magic to say. Look, you know, I think these are going to be very good years for the treasuries of environmental organizations, okay? Not necessarily for their accomplishments, but for their treasuries, and I think they deserve a lot of support, either financial or volunteering or whatever. There is an election in 2 years, not for president, but a congressional election in 2 years, and I don't know how that's going to go. As many people have pointed out, of the 30, you know, a third of the Senate is up every 2 years, so of these 33, 25 are Democrats and only 8 Republicans, and so, and of those 25, something like 10 are in states that Donald Trump carried. So, you know, there is a significant risk of things getting worse before they get better. On the other hand, the historical pattern is the midterm election is terrible for the president and the president's party, and it means that a lot is up for grabs, and it's not too early to start thinking about working on campaigns or whatever for that election. And then again, as everyone has pointed out, stuff at the state and local level is going to be more important than ever, and that's a place to act.
So the sad fact is that environmentalists typically show the most solidarity when they oppose something. And environmentalists are much better in opposition than when...
Can I just say that this event is very good proof of that?
Yeah, okay. And when environmentalists get close to power, things don't always go very well. You know, and I mean, I'm going to exaggerate slightly, but when environmentalists get close to power, they start cutting each other's throats over carbon taxes versus cap and trade, for example. When they're in opposition, they're often much more effective and much more in touch with the core values that really get people into the environmental movement in the first place. Where I would like to see all of this go over the next 4 years is while the large environmental groups are going to become much richer, and that's a good thing, and I hope they become more powerful inside the Beltway, but I also hope the environmental movement gets more in touch with its grassroots basis out in the country, through different social classes, through different ethnicities, and really begins to do a better job of really expressing the fact that this concern for the environment is really as old as the country and as intrinsic to the country as anything that Donald Trump and his supporters talk about. And the last thing I would say is we want to protect the environment so that we can have good lives and so that we can flourish and so the rest of nature can flourish as well. So there is something particularly tragic and paradoxical about the hardworking environmentalists all crumpled up at their desk eating junk food and never getting a breath of fresh air. So in this, of all cases, it's important to stay in touch with the values that bring you to the concern about nature and the environment in the first place.
So I think political activity continues to be very important. There should be a lot more of it. If you come across people who didn't vote this time because they thought that it wouldn't make a difference, don't literally strangle them. but I think you should make it very
legal advice.
That's right. That's but make it clear it really does make an enormous difference whether they participate. I hope some of you will run for office. Again, I'm talking about for the good of society, not necessarily for the good of yourselves. You'll make that own decision. Help build things. Help build the environmentally beneficial things we need, like wind and solar and other renewables. And finally, this is in line with what Dale just said. Go climb a mountain. Swim in a lake. Remember that there really is an environment out there worth saving. And that we need to be aware of the importance of that, of how precious the environment is, how endangered it is. And that, I think, will also help motivate you to go forward to do the hard, difficult work. It's become a lot more difficult than it seemed a couple of weeks ago. But it is even more important, and it is still very possible.
Great answer for everyone. I really liked all your answers.
Do we get an A on the exam?
That's on my exam, absolutely. So it's a little past 7. Can we maybe take like 2 questions, just like maybe rudimentarily?
We also, just to let you know, right after this, the professors have so kindly agreed to stay for a reception. We've got some food outside, so for anyone who has additional questions, you can come on up and have more discussion.
Okay. I generally don't like question periods, so you can blame me for making it very short. All right. This person's sound went up really quickly.
Yes, it did. Thanks so much. I've been worried about this a lot, so this helped clarify some things and also led to some questions. I'm going to ask sort of a 2-parter, so hopefully that's okay. One, early on you were saying, I think Professor Herz was saying that, like, I don't think he's going to do this, I don't think he's going to do that. And I was reading in New York Magazine today an interview with Van Jones, who's like a racial environmental justice powerhouse, and he was saying, like, at the same time of like assuming the best, we need to prepare for the worst. And I think I'm wondering, sort of like to elaborate on that last question, like how to tactically and strategically prepare for the worst, and like what to read and who to call, and like specific ways that citizens can act and sort of interject our own power. to prepare for the worst.
Do I ask the second part too, or?
That was like kind of both.
That was both,
Basically, like,
okay.
we also need to prepare for the worst, which was like my first question.
Yeah,
Which was not a question. And actually, yeah, there are things that you asked. So you also mentioned that the big focus is bills that make the rich richer, which is like obvious based on some of the priority items. Isn't that too sort of inherently an environmental issue, like making the rich richer and like just capitalism as it functions in our society? And how can we, as environmentalists, really work to build those alternatives that bring wealth to communities, but in a way that respects the environment? Yeah.
Well, why don't I start by addressing the first. There are many varieties of worst, and so the reaction will depend on what it is, but there are certainly groups out there like 350.org that go out and do a lot of mass demonstrations, which I expect there will be more of. I mean, it depends on people's own personal inclinations of what kind of activity that they want to engage in. Some of the worst activities will be susceptible to litigation, and so supporting the groups that do that would be helpful. Others are appointments that will require Senate confirmation, such as the head of EPA. And if one of the worst candidates like Ebel is nominated, then I think there's going to have to be an enormous amount of organization in certain states to try to deny the confirmation. And other things may just require large-scale protest.
So it's extremely difficult to position yourself relative to someone who has no position. And that's part of the difficulty with Trump now, is essentially he said everything and he said nothing. Other than his own personal wealth, there don't seem to be sort of any guiding principles that serve to explain his behavior. So it's, I mean that seriously, not as an exaggeration or a slight. I think in fact, he'd probably consider that a compliment. But so you sort of have to be ready for everything. But I also think it's sort of important not to jump at every piece of bait that's thrown in some direction or another, because there's way too much of that bait that's out there. So in a way, I don't feel the signals are yet really clear about where the most important place is going to be to take action. The second question that you asked, I think, is a really complicated question, and I'll just say something very quick and unsatisfactory, which is we all have multiple values. I mean, I'm an egalitarian and I'm an environmentalist. Does environmentalism imply egalitarianism? No, I don't think so. I think you can actually have societies that are extremely inegalitarian that can protect a lot of the environmental values that I want to see protected. Is that the society I prefer? No. But I do think there is a tendency for people to sort of try to weave too many values together as if they're all one single thing, and then think, the root of the problem is capitalism or neoliberalism or some big abstraction like that, when in fact it's much better to take the issues, I think, on a case-by-case basis.
Nothing to add.
Okay, so for those of you who might need to leave, we don't want to hold you, so please feel free. Like I said, we have some vegan sandwiches and fruit platter right outside. You can feel free to take and come back in, and then any other questions you have, definitely come forward and we can discuss some more.
Thank you so much.